I would ask those of you with telephones or other electronic equipment that may cause noise, please to put that on silent so that our speaker can speak uninterruptedly. On behalf of the Armenian Studies program, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation. While you were sitting here, again, you saw some of our upcoming events, and I want to remind you that in 1 week, on Friday, March the 2nd, the Armenian Studies program, in cooperation with the Philip Lawrence Keyboard Concert Series, is presenting a concert of Levon Chilingarian, Bagratuni, and Hagopian. That's going to take place in the concert hall at Fresno State. If you're interested in tickets, I do have tickets with me tonight, and also you can get those tickets online by going to the Keyboard Concert Series. This is going to be an excellent concert. It'll start at 8 o'clock on Friday, March the 2nd. This is a world-renowned trio. They're going to be playing both Armenian and also classical music in their performances. Also, our next lecture by our visiting professor, Dr. Yektan Turkilmaz. Would you stand up, please? And let's acknowledge his presence here tonight. He gave his first lecture, it seems like just like yesterday, but it was a couple of weeks ago. He's going to give a very interesting lecture on Wednesday, March the 7th. It's going to be on Armenian record production, Armenians on records, music production from homeland to diasporas. And his particular area of interest is in records and Armenian records. So he's going to speak about that at 7:30 p.m. in the same hall here, and it'll be his second lecture in the three-part series that he will be giving. And then on Sunday, March 18th is the Armenian Studies Program 30th Annual Banquet, which we're going to hold at Fort Washington Country Club. If you're interested in information about that, you can see me afterwards. And then a new addition, another event, is going to take place on Monday, March the 19th, when Dr. Haik Demoyan, who is the director of the Armenian Genocide and Museum Institute in Yerevan, will be coming to Fresno to speak on Armenians and memory in the world. He is currently in Boston at Harvard University on a U.S. Fulbright program. So he will be here on Monday, March the 19th, the day after our banquet, to give a talk. We will have plenty of other events that are coming up. If you'd like to stay informed, please check our Facebook at Armenian Studies, or also you can go to the Armenian Studies program website. So tonight, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Ara Sarafian is a frequent guest to the Armenian Studies program. Tonight, he's going to speak about Van 1915, and it's primarily about a new book that he and the Gomidas Institute have published. It's a first-hand eyewitness account of the events of 1915 in the area of Van. So this is why it's so important. It was published first in Yerevan in 1917 in Armenian by Hovannes Dir Mardirosyan, but he's known by the name Ado. So if you hear the name Ado, it's referring to this man who actually wrote the book in Armenian, and then Gomidas Institute translated it into English and has recently published it. Unfortunately, Ara brought just a few copies. We've already sold out, and some of you have already said you're interested in purchasing copies. If you are, see me afterwards. I'll write down your name, and I will get you copies of the book. So this is going to be a very interesting insight into the area of Van through the eyes of someone who lived in that area and was a very, very important eyewitness to it. Ara Sarafian is a historian. He specializes in the late Ottoman period and modern Turkey. As I said, he's the founding director of the Gomidas Institute and is its current director. And he has written and edited critical introductions to several of the Institute's publications. You can go online to Gomidas Institute and see his work, his publications, and also, very interestingly, the blogs that he publishes about his activities both in Turkey and in other parts of the world dealing with the Armenians. So without any further introduction, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Ara Sarafian.
Well, once again, I'd like to thank the Armenian Studies program at Fresno, and I'd like to thank you for being here today. When I first started doing this type of work, almost 30 years ago, and the Gomidas was created, I never expected it to get this far. We've published over 100 books now. We do all kinds of projects in Turkey, histories that is a living presence with us today. It's not just about the past. And Fresno has played a very important role in that development. I don't know if you realize it, but Fresno has a global presence in influencing the development of modern Armenian studies. When Yektan is here, you have all these people coming who are encouraged to continue with their work. I was encouraged as a young scholar, and you play a very important role in the development of Armenian studies, not just here, but actually globally. And you should be aware of that. And I, as an outsider, treasure what this program represents. Today's talk is based around I'm a historian, but today's talk is on the work of somebody else, which I translated it. It's my first translation, and I picked this one because of its seminal importance. But I also put a lot of information in a more succinct form so we can project it. I thought I would start with this map, which I generated. You might have seen an earlier version. This is the latest version. It gives you a sense of when we talk of Armenians before World War I or just on the eve of World War I, what was the distribution? The red represents Ottoman Armenians or Turkish Armenians. I added the Caucasus because today's talk is what happens in that part of the world and the Russian Armenians, as we call them, the Russian Empire, and also a small number of Iranian, Persian Armenians, and also Assyrians, because they were a Christian presence and they fared pretty much as Armenians did. So, and this gives you an idea of the distribution of populations, their relative size, so you have a sort of conception. But today's event concerned this part of the world here, Van, Mazid, Hakkari. That's the Vasbouragan region. I first came across Ado as a student, and it was his first publication. It was called the Armeno-Tatar fighting of 1905. In 1905, there was a major clashes in the Russian Empire between Armenians and Azeris, as we would call them today. And Ado wrote, this guy I never heard of before, Ado wrote this amazing report on it, very detailed, analytical, and particularly well presented. But as I didn't specialize in Caucasus, I sort of put it aside. Then I came across another very important book, published in 1912, also by Ado. It was called the Vilayets of Vani Bitlis and Erzurumi Vilayetler, the provinces of Van, Bitlis, and Erzurum. And once more, this was Ado's work. And one of his characteristics was his almost academic approach to these issues, his distinction between sources and analysis, his meticulous presentation of data and where he got it from, which is quite unusual. So the journalistic style, but he has a scholarly style. And so Ado was this amazing Armenian intellectual with amazing acumen and writing ability, who on the eve of First World War, and I will touch on these events themselves, found himself going to the Ottoman Empire. Because during the First World War, the Russians advanced and actually captured Van in May 1915. And Ado was sent to Van, or he went, it's not entirely clear, but he was sent to Van to compile a report, quite logically. This was his forte, to compile a report on what had happened in Van, especially in April and May. Great fighting, massacres, and so forth. And Ado went there to compile a report. What he didn't realize at the time was that the developments in Van, the drama was not over. And in a subsequent month or so, he himself became a witness. So Ado's book, which is actually a report, became important for two reasons. One, Ado as this key intermediary who went there to report on what had happened in Van itself, but Ado also became a witness to the creation of this provisional Armenian government, a government in Van, about which we know very little, and of course Yektan is a person you should ask, it's a specialization, an Armenian government in Van, and what was called the mass exodus, the grand exodus of Armenians. So by the end of July, there was a mass exodus of Armenians from throughout this area, from Mush and Van, survivors who went to the Caucasus, and that was a major event in modern Armenian history. And one reason today, if you go to Hayastan, Armenia, there are so many Vanetsis and Mushetsis, was because many of them managed to survive this period and to go to the Caucasus. And I would guess 1 in 3 Armenians in the Republic of Armenia today have some blood from this part of the world. They're, in this sense, they're Turkish Armenians who ended up in the Caucasus. Okay, so when we talk of this part of the world, it's a fascinating region. This is a map that I created on the basis of demographic data from a Russian, I guess, intelligence officer. And the data comes from circa 1900, and it gives an ethnic profile of this part of the world. What is absolutely fascinating is that this whole Van area was almost exclusively Armenian and Turkish, Armenian Kurdish. It's almost like a colonial area where it was ruled from the center of the Ottoman Empire, but it had no real Turkish presence. The biggest one marked you, the black is Turkish. Even that I would contend. I think there were Turkish speakers, there were not Turks. And same with Bitlis. Often they're regarded as being, Yektan is agree, I'm glad. They're actually Kurdish. So this was almost exclusively Armenian, Armenian, Kurdish, Greek, and Assyrians as well further south. And this is a part of the drama of what happened and the role that and I will say Turkish state played, because by this time, by World War I, Turkey was, the Ottoman Empire was already in the process of Turkification. And that's something we should be aware of. Well, why did the genocide take place? Why were in some ways Kurds used against Armenians in such a vicious way? If you want to rule an area, you don't pit one group against the other in the way that they did. And it's almost a colonial policy of destroying one group by setting one group against the other. But this is a very useful map because it's as far as maps and data go, it's relatively, I would say it's relatively reliable, and it gives you a good sense of what this part of the world represented. And you can see this, the Van Basin itself had a very large Armenian concentration. I mean, about half or over half, and also in the Mush area. So it is actually a fact that the Armenians were certainly, I would say, the dominant element, and the Kurds were further south. This map, again, one more time, this is just the Armenians, so it gives you an idea of distribution, just the Armenians, and the numbers indicate the fact that they lived in villages. Now, often when you're in Armenia, you ask people, well, you know, where are you from? We'll say, we're Vanesis, and I said, well, we're in Van, and that memory is already going. People don't remember that they actually come from the villages. Everyone did not come from Van city itself. They came from the villages. And one of the values of this book, again, that's the meticulous writer, is that as part of his own study and report, he actually listed 450 Armenian settlements throughout this period. So we know the names of 450 different villages and towns where there was an Armenian presence. In fact, Ado is the #1 resource in this regard, because which is used by demographers today. So part of his report was to gather information. He'd done demographic work before, but when he was there a second time during World War I, he actually compiled a new list. You can quibble about the numbers. Demography is not a science, at least in the Ottoman Empire. This is my perspective, but it gives you a certain sense of population size and distribution. And so, Ado's book actually starts by giving this data. This is from Ado, and we have the names of the actual villages, and towns and villages themselves. Now, if we were to, I'll leave that. So, Ado, when he went to Van, back to his report. The key elements of Ado were therefore, he was a meticulous worker, he was a very good writer, but he had a very good analytical ability. So when you look at his report, the importance of the report lies in the fact that the context in which he provides a vital context in which the events of 1915 in Van took place, so the context is one. Then there are specific categories of analytical categories that he used to clarify the developments that took place at the same time, and then put his own analysis based on that. So, just to give you, next slide. So analytical category. So when Adam went there, as part of the explanation, he starts his entire narrative of the massacres of Van in 1915 from the 1908 revolution. The Ottoman Empire went to a revolution, and he explains how, for all the expectations that the empire would change, the empire did not do so because of conservative reactions, inability to allow equality between the various elements. And by 1912, the Ottoman Empire itself had internal problems and external problems. It had lost 2 major wars, and the whole politics changed to a radical Turkish nationalist position. In this context, Armenians were not simple victims. Armenians were still agents in their own right. The Armenian political parties were actively looking out of their own interests, their own national interests, including organizing Armenians this is a bit of distraction, organizing Armenians in terms of arming themselves. So there's these tensions within the Ottoman Empire, a state that is nationalistic on the one hand, unwilling to compromise, and actually drifting towards war on the side, as it happened on the side of Germany. And Armenians are now more and more actors in their own right. So Armenian political parties did not simply watch what was going on. Armenian political parties had their own policies, and their own at the local level as well as the national level. And Van was a particularly active area in terms of organizing self-defense. This is of vital importance because it's a critical part of the narrative. Armenians resisted what happened to them in Van. This is an issue that Ado talks about. By importing weapons from the early period from Russia through the mountains into Van region, and organizing wherever they could villages into defensive local units, some mobile units that could be moved around, and their primary purpose was actually not against the state but against the local Kurds. So the central government had its policy of allowing certain Kurdish tribes and the depredation, shall we say, vis-a-vis the Armenians. But now the Armenians were organizing also against the Kurdish tribes. And these organized units, these organized village armed units, became a vital element in 1915 in opposing the state. So we have a very, again, it's a complex narrative, and what Ado is doing is factorizing these different elements, understanding what the context in which the Armenians operated and how they were organizing vis-a-vis the local elements, in this case Kurdish groups, but also the state. So that is the context in which the developments they start. And the key Armenian elements were, in Van itself, there was a parliamentary deputy by 1915, Vramian. There had Armenian revolutionaries like Aram Manukyan, Ishkhan. There is a significant Armenian presence and a large population. So Van is a particularly interesting area within the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans drift into the war. The Ottoman Empire did not have to enter the First World War, but it did. And Ado's account tells us a great deal of how did the Ottomans enter the war and what its implication was for the Armenians. Armenians as a sort of a targeted population that was not really welcomed by the state. And then as the Ottoman Empire entered the war, what were the key stages? And it goes by chapter. One was mobilization. When World War I broke out, before the Turks actually also joined it, they mobilized. During this mobilization process, all elements were eligible for conscription, including Armenians. And he gives a very detailed account of how, actually the word comes is mismanagement, how ill-prepared the Ottomans were to actually integrate these various elements into the army. And descriptions, which can be verified elsewhere, was they didn't have the capacity to house these people or feed these people or arm these people. And in this context, Armenians as an underclass, in that sense, they fared particularly worse than perhaps others. Armenians also fared worse because, as he explained, and this is again non-partisan, he said whereas the Turks and Kurds, or some Kurds, had done military service before for decades, Armenians had only been recently introduced into the army after the 19th Revolution, if at all. So they were already not necessarily good soldiers either. So it was a complex affair. But Armenians were in the army with a large number of desertions, especially later on. Within the army, he gives examples of discrimination against them in terms of just arming themselves, but of food and sustenance. They were more in use in the labor battalions. So already tensions there. But so that's the second point is requisitions. The war was used as an excuse to, as he would say, plunder Armenians. Because of disorganization, the state could go and confiscate supposedly foodstuff and other war materials, but effectively it was a way to plunder those who had material goods, in this case particularly the Armenians, the merchant class. And this is something we hear not just in Van, but other places in Harpert and Erzurum and Diyarbakir, as you know. So this whole idea of plundering Armenians, he gives a very detailed account of how was that Tekalifi Harbiye and the war requisitions, and how they would go and they would empty Armenian shops supposedly for the war effort. And all this played into the drama and all the and then the tragedy that followed, because including starvation during wartime. The Ottomans were not prepared to go war. It was an adventure for the leaders, and this played up at the local level. And Ardo is looking at one place, which was Van. And as you would expect, as part of an analysis, he starts identifying specific incidents that took place and categorizing them. And he didn't explain everything in terms of a state policy to hurt Armenians. A lot of what happened could be explained as local phenomena. There were clashes here and there. Once during the war, between not just between Armenians and Kurds and locals, but when you have there were clashes in certain villages that were pacified. So these events happened. He identified them. He categorizes them as part of his report. And all this during the time when there's a war, the Russian advance. But as the war progressed by end of 1914, these events become worse and worse. Now there are cases of massacres, there are cases of shooting of men in the army. And what's interesting is that many of these events are now being reported or being contested by Armenians themselves, because the war's happening, these events take place, but Armenians still have representatives in the Ottoman Empire. Varamian, the parliamentary deputy, even starts petitioning the local government, but also the central government, about these events. Armenians, even during the war, they're contesting. They say there are massacres, and we have details of these massacres by days, and this I put on the map, which Ardo is the key intermediary. He's telling us what's going on. And there are key, as it was taking place, there are massacres at specific places, Vazkesen, whatever, Satman's village, by date, how it took place, who was involved. And Varamian is making this into a political issue during the war itself, but with the expectation that the state would take appropriate action. And of course, there is no appropriate action. And this only plays into the polarization and the background to what comes next. But this is so when we talk about massacres or individual killings or group killings in end of 1914, this is what we're talking about. So he details these specific massacres that were taking place at that time as part of his report. And indeed, as the Russians advanced, and they at one point they withdrew back, already you have Armenians from the border areas going back with the Russian army because they fear persecution and massacres or further massacres themselves. And this data comes from Ado once more. And he gives a very specific data of number of groups of people who are going to the Caucasus, including from Iran. These are not just Armenians, but they also include Assyrians who fled with the Armenians. And his reports are not in. This is a very dry, sort of almost Anglo-Saxon presentation, dating nice pie charts. He gives more literary accounts of what it's like, of survivors themselves. What's it like to go through the middle of winter, especially in this part of the world, having to flee, children being frozen to death, and he actually captures the essence in a almost journalistic way of what it was like for Armenians to flee, and the memory and what that leads to afterwards. So this is another development at the time from Ado's report, and if it were not for this report, we'd be none the wiser for it. But so Ado is collecting this data, this information. He's putting it in concise form, but also in a literary form. And it makes harrowing reading if you were once you look at it. And then you have the incidents, as he says. He calls them incidents because they're not necessarily part of, they don't have to lead anywhere. But there were incidents throughout this period between Armenians and Turks and Kurds of the army. There's one particular I like is Gargar. Gargar is an area in which the way he presents it is that the local elements, they went looking for Armenians who had fled from the Ottoman army, supposedly. And there are incidents. We're talking about a village of 60 people and a group of cluster of villages, maybe, 60 households, 200. But Gargar was an area in the mountains where the Ottoman authorities went, and there was a firefight. When the soldiers were looking for deserters, Ado says they committed certain, shall we say, unpleasant acts with the locals, and there was a couple of them were shot, and the Ottomans sent in a pacification, and that's an incident. It happened. It was over with. In this case, the Armenians were, completely. They lost. The local population had to flee, but that's an incident. But it's an incident that informed others. There's an incident, Adnan and Pelu. These are small incidents. He specifies what those incidents were. This is very important because in contemporary, out of 450 villages, these are specific incidents. It's important because in contemporary Turkish historiography, those same incidents are also invoked as examples of Armenian rebellion. So context is very important. The scale is very important. And it's very interesting that the same ones, there's one here and one up there, specific incidents are taken in a very different way. According to Ado, these are local incidents. Often they don't lead, then that's the end of it. Some of them are resolved, like Atanan, they're resolved with the participation of local Armenians because the Armenian leaders did not want these fights to take place. They were in a very precarious position. So Ado specifies his incident and he puts in very specific context. And I'll come back to the Turkish geography later. And he's very specific. So Gargaz was one. There's another one here where you had a bunch of Kurdish, Amari Chatos, one, Kurdish recruits who were allowed to go to the front, about 600 of them were allowed to go to the front to supposedly fight the Russians, but on the way they plunder Armenian villages. They plunder Armenian villages in a particularly nasty way. And when they reach are in a village, Armenians decide that they're not going to let these guys to plunder the next village. And we're talking about 25 Armenians, and then others come outside. 60 armed Armenians who ambush about 500 to 600 lightly armed Kurds. So that's another incident. So he describes in greater detail than what I've read certainly in Turkish historiography. But that's another small incident that even Varanian says addressed with the governor, saying if the Ottoman authorities keep order, you don't allow these people, these elements, to plunder Armenian villages, we're not going to have these problems. And the accusation is that the authorities are allowing this to happen for their own political purposes. But Ado actually identifies, categorizes these specific incidents in a particular way, which is vital because of what happened, what happens next. Now, I'm not sure what a map for this. This is a critical point. Now, when we talk about the Armenian genocide, we talk about April 24, when the Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople were arrested, sent away, eventually killed. One could easily talk of the Armenian genocide in terms of, I would say, April the 16th, because April the 16th, or thereabouts, is a time where the local authorities in Van decided on a policy of mass murder. So the massacres in Van can be pinpointed to that period when, in a matter of a few days already, Armenian men throughout this region were arrested and effectively summarily executed. The mass murder was a choice that the Ottoman authorities embarked on, and this is something that we can talk specifically. And when I was working on Ado, before I decided to translate, I said, well, I need to sort of check this one out. And we're lucky well, this is Ado's data. According to Ado, in the Argesh region alone, and he gives, and this is an area he specifically investigated himself, he gives his own data. He said that in Argesh region, Armenians did not embark on, or did not defend themselves. All right, so, and he said, and he looked at, how many Armenians survived this period. And according to his data, and he gives some harrowing account of mass murder from some survivors, the red represents a number of people who did not, men and women by the way, and there were very specific, men were the target. The black is the number of people who were killed, according to Ado. The gray area is the number of people, as he says, that were kidnapped, all right? The darker shade of gray, that one there, is, which is not entirely clear, are the people they call dead. But about a third of all men were killed in this part of the world in a matter of a few days. This is Ado. And then, of course, these people are the ones who fled to Armenia, present-day Armenia. That's what happened, but this is something different. But starting April 16th, the Jevdet embarked on a policy of killing as many Armenian men as possible, and this is something that we see Argesh. This is what I checked using other sources too, but there were similar accounts from Bashkale region. I'm sure there are nuances, but by and large we can say that the state chose to embark on a policy of mass murder on April the 16th, 1915. In the case of Pavlagis, from memory, we have one individual who describes how he was taken to the city. He was kept at the Kishlag, at the barracks, and how they were taken out in groups and they were shot dead. You know, they would march south past Ororan, and he says in this particular area they were shot dead. And he describes what it was like to be taken. He knew the other people he was with in groups. He himself, of course, survived, which is how the information came out. But by and large, this was a mass execution organized by the state authorities. This is not a sort of a firefight or some local elements. This is the state authority using the gendarme and even the barracks to carry the murder. So this is the essential element of his analysis of how Armenian massacres began in Van in 1915. He said that the massacres did not take place elsewhere at this time, because the massacres in other provinces, the massacres, took place a bit late in July 1915, places like Karpet. But the first massacres were organized by Jevdet in this part of the world, and according to his suggestion, it was ideologically motivated, and the main difference, and the way it was played out was that wherever Armenians resisted, as in Van and Shadakh, Armenians fared much better than those places where they chose not to resist. And he gives specific typologies. One was the Argesh region we touched on before. He gives a typology of one place where Armenian workers were taken, soldiers were taken, Ameles, as workers in Pergri area. And he talks about how the soldiers were taken away and killed in groups using eyewitness account. And then he talks about Hirj. Now Hirj is also interesting because one of the first victims who were killed at this time were the Armenian leaders. And the way Jevdet arranged that was, in the case of the one leader was Ishkhan, he was sent on a supposed pacification mission to Shadakh. He was sent to actually, with a group of Turkish officials as well as Armenians, to pacify some fighting or some tensions in the Shadakh area. When they were, the first place, the night they stayed was a village of Hirj. Ishkhan and his companions were murdered by Circassin, that means government troops. They were killed outright. Vramian himself, by the way, in Van was entrapped and also murdered. But the other leader, Ishkhan, escaped, and he was part of the defense of Van itself. What's interesting is in Hirj, also, but Ado takes and we know about the killings of Ishkhan in Hirj, but he also says what happens next. And he gives account from a women's perspective, how Hirj was a predominantly Kurdish village, 70-40 percentage, how the village was surrounded by government troops after the killing of the leaders, and the men were arrested. They were taken to Reshu Agha's house, and how they were shot dead. And this, again, it's a typology of one village in which the men once more, first the men were taken away, the date on which they were killed, and where they were buried. And others, so this is a level of more specific, sort of literary accounts of actual killing from the witnesses themselves is part of his report. So it's not just dry numbers, but specific cases. Another one is in Pergre area. He talks about this particular poor area, predominantly non-Armenian Kurdish area, and how their Kurdish neighbors were telling them these massacres are being organized, warning them. But and then it talks about how they were taken away, how they were taken to the village of is it Golod? Yeah, not village, the bridge, and how they were killed. I think it's some harrowing accounts how individuals were killed and the bodies were thrown in the water. So Ado has this very analytical approach, but there's also a very literary approach. This map is from his book, and here he shows a very familiar map that's been used many others. I colorize it for our purposes today, but these are the two areas of Van where the Armenians organized a defense. In Van, Armenians did not allow the authorities to disarm the Armenian men, and they embarked on a systematic defense in the Aikestan area and in the old city. And the green, this is the green is where the government, the Muslim quarters were. And his book has a huge section on how the defense of Van was organized in terms of position and in groups and command structures. And he describes how Armenians, as the fighting was going on, they developed the capacity to repair their arms, to fill their cartridges, a whole trench system of communications, and the Armenians in Van fought until the Russians arrived in May 19, about 30 days, May 1915. So, and it's a fascinating account. They even had their own band playing music for morale, actually, and so it's a very detailed account, a chronological account, and there are other accounts, by the way. He's not the only one, but he was one of the first ones to actually publish it. And he gives a very detailed of how they were under bombardment from the government forces, and how they fought back themselves. And Van survived because they fought back, and then eventually the Russians, when they came, they were completely liberated, and Van became supposedly the capital of a provisional Armenian government at the time. So it's a huge section. The other one that he gives a great deal of detail on is the detail of Shadakh in the mountains. This is also an area in which Armenians particularly were well organized. I'll make it a bit bigger. I'm not sure I can do this. And the detail is rather incredible. You might have seen it. But you know, the Shadakh region, which are the Armenian villages, Kurdish villages, key bridges, all right, fortresses. And here's an account, a chronological account, the tactics that were used to keep away government forces at Pesantash at the troops at the north, so that they couldn't bring in reinforcements. And the Armenians organized their own defense, while the government brought in local Kurdish tribes from further south to fight against them. And it's a very, again, once more, very detailed account of, by this time, was a genocide, I would argue, on the one hand, on the government side, and Armenians resisting. And Shadakh was also successful. There were also such cases of defense in Hayat Sor area, in the Timar area. You know, Lim, the monastery of Lim, which was on an island, became a sanctuary. So thousands of Armenians fled there to fight back, and they were also liberated when the Russians came. So it's a fascinating account of modern, even urban warfare. One can analyze this information, all kinds of perspectives. But what's interesting is that already by 1917, someone like Ado had analyzed this, had compiled a report in detail, and he made a pretty good case. One of the question that this is the city of Van in 1916. One of the issues comes, well, how many Armenians were killed at this time? I'm not sure it's entirely clear, at least from the massacre period. According to the Russians, they got rid of 55,000 or so. You agree? 55,000 Armenian corpses for sanitary reasons, and they kept tab of this. But I think that includes the Mush area. Van area itself was about 120,000 people, but then I guess we doubled that for Mush. But a significant number of Armenians were killed in the villages, but a very significant number of Armenians also survived precisely because they fought back, because they were armed. And that's an issue that Ado comes back to again. Wherever there was actually resistance, they survived. Where the Armenians thought that by not resisting, the state would not actually kill them, they were wrong. And this is a theme also happened elsewhere. In Kharpet, if you read the accounts, the missionary accounts, said nobody expected what happened, and the expectation was that if you simply give in to the government, give whatever they want, at least you'll save your lives. In this case, was not the case, and that was also not the case in Van itself. And the rest of the narrative is the government of Van and the mass exodus of Van, which is another harrowing account of thousands, tens of thousands of Armenians being forced to leave this area within a matter of a week or so, for the Caucasus at the end of July. And he gives certain details even in present-day Armenia. I was surprised this year, I'm quite sure. Like, he describes the refugees, the way they were dying in the streets of Yerevan and Echmiadzin. He talks about mass graves. I never realized, but I verified. In Echmiadzin today, there are mass graves of thousands of Armenians who were buried at the time. I think we should actually memorialize that. But, I mean, Armenian refugees being forced to go to Caucasus, so their suffering and their death didn't stop by resisting in the Van area. They went to the Caucasus and they succumbed to disease, they succumbed to starvation, because the authorities there were not equipped to look after these places. And Ado, once more, gives a harrowing account of what that meant, because those harrowing accounts are not just simply literary devices, they're actually part of the experience itself. This is why Armenians feel the way they do, because that's part of, in a sense, you feel it in your bones because you've seen the survivors tell you about it. That's how I relate to the genocide, because I'm old enough to have known these people. And it explains the intensity that Armenians as victims feel, and the idea that, I say, yeah, I never used to say that, but I'm a third Holocaust survivor. I'm a third generation survivor of the Armenian genocide, because in a sense that is who we are, and I think that is a language that we should also employ. And this book explains to us why Armenians, our grandparents' generation felt as they did, and the intensity, what they had to live through, even as supposedly survivors, and why this is still part of who we are today. It's part of our own makeup today, because that memory hasn't gone, and frankly, we might argue that it shouldn't go. There's a lot we can learn from it. So Ado plays a very important role in recording a very important part of modern Armenian history, and I may add an important part, and today it has an added significance, because in recent years, as we know, the denialist lobby denying the Armenian genocide, but one of the key themes that they're still hanging on to, especially in this country, and some newcomers like, Erickson is one, the other one is McMeegan, I think, Sean McMeegan, they argue this whole idea that in 1915, Armenians were rebels, that what happened was a counterinsurgency warfare. The Ottomans were trying to control these rebellious people. There were no massacres. The Armenians killed as many as Turks. I mean, you sort of mix up fact and fiction, which is why someone like Ado is of vital importance, because he puts a very different context. He provides a much richer narrative, much richer explanation than Turkish historiography. There's some of those events that I talked about, a small event in one particular village, which is of no other significance, today is being used as an example of Armenian rebellion. Well, it wasn't a rebellion. We can't call it a rebellion. So it's important, and I believe that the denialists picked the Van as an example because they figured that Armenians don't have the evidence on their side, and it's enough of a gray area because they resisted, then you can use it as an example of, well, these guys are rebels. I think there was a strategic choice that they made, but it's a wrong one, because what they didn't anticipate was that the level of documentation we have in Armenian, not just Ado is the first one because of 1917, but we have affidavits. In the Caucasus, they collected statements from survivors in archival form. They're still there today. In fact, I examined some of Ado's work in that context, and that's why I gave a lot more credence to it. So the debate about what happened in Van today is also linked to the denial of the Armenian genocide, an attempt on the Turkish or state part to try and rationalize it and to justify first say it wasn't a genocide, it was massacres in which Armenians themselves were primary, not victims, but also victimizers. It's not true. We can say that in more categorical terms, partly because we have a clear understanding of what happened there in 1915. And so it's worth taking on the deniers on this particular issue, because I don't think they have the arguments on their side. It's remarkable how little there is on the Turkish side. Their citations come from Turkish military archives in Ankara, which are not accessible today. You know, given that there was a mass murder of Armenians in 1916, you would argue, they don't quite admit that. They say, yes, some Armenian leaders were killed, but they don't admit that actually there was a systematic murder of boys and men. That part is still being denied, but there's no question about that. There must be correspondence between, say, the governor of Van and the central authority. There must be correspondence. Where is that record? We don't know. It's either been destroyed or certainly is not available. So it's important for us to get now into the Turkish military archives too, if only to say that record has been expunged. But what we can say clearly is that those American scholars who cite Turkish archives in Ankara, who actually legitimize them by citing them, but by not being critical, by not asking the very question I'm just asking now. Where is the evidence that supposedly, that even if it's not real, that they feared an Armenian uprising? Where is that evidence? Where is that correspondence? At least make that available. Even that hasn't been presented. I would argue because the decision to murder Armenians was, my personal opinion now, was a political decision on the part of the authorities. And we could, for all we know, it is part of a long plan of mass murder of the Ottoman Armenian population. It certainly fits in with what we know about 1915, the whole idea of Turkification of the Ottoman Empire, the move against, of course, the genocide was spread to other parts of the Ottoman Empire, the assimilation, the murder of Kurds that started during the World War I. We don't know much about that, but it's already started because they're also a non-Turkic element. The movement of Turkish, or ethnic, supposedly Turkish muhajirs, or settlers and refugees into these areas. The Ottomans were already changing the landscape of the Ottoman Empire at this, even during World War time. The idea of Turkification had already started, and it's something that continued in the Turkish Republic. Modern day Turkey was created, first the ideology came with Turkification, Turkism and Turkification, war, and its afterwards was a period in which that ideology, informed by the ideology, they began to recreate the landscape and population landscape of what became the modern Turkish Republic. The idea was to get rid of Armenians, the idea was to assimilate non-Turkic elements, even through massacre, and that's the legacy of 1915, and that's the context in which also, wider political context, in which the Armenian genocide was carried out. So Van is only one part, and a very important part of that process. It's an important part of our own understanding as Armenians of our own history, and of course it has its political context too today in terms of the denial on the one part, and of course the politics of recognizing the Armenian genocide, and some Armenians will insist reparations and the whole question of responsibility, which still has not been addressed properly today. I'd like to stop that, and if you have any questions, please.
Thank you, Professor Sarafian, for bringing to light Ado's very important contribution to Armenian historiography. So we're going to open it up at this point for questions. If you do have a question, please state it directly to Ara, and he will give you your response. So, you have questions? Yes.
Actually, regarding this map and the large number of Assyrians shown on this map, what is the Turkish government's official party line as to why they included the Assyrians into the genocide and deportations, being that they did not have the same nationalistic aspirations that the Armenians had?
Well, to be truthful, I actually don't know. We can speculate, but I think from their perspective, the Assyrians were also actually they were armed minority. Yekta might be a better person to answer that question, but I don't know. What we can say as a fact, as an observation, is that it was a fact that they were massacred, and they were not just massacred in the Ottoman Empire, they were also massacred in Iran. There are a large number in the Urmia area, and they are massacred or they had to flee to Armenia or further south. So we can assert that it happened, but a lot of these things we don't know because Turkish archives are closed. If we wasn't thinking of the young Turks, the government of the Ottoman Empire, we don't know because it's almost as a crime has taken place, and the suspect is controlling the evidence. I mean, that's the position we find ourselves in today, as far as the Ottoman archives go, because the Turkish state, which is itself under accusation of a genocide, is controlling the very archive from the Ottoman side. And which is why alternative sources like this or American reports are so vital in order to have a better understanding of what's going on. Unfortunately for Assyrians have never really recovered. They have never really presented themselves. Armenians have, relatively speaking, have done reasonably well. But Assyrians don't have a voice in this debate. We really don't know that much. I know there are some Assyrian accounts of what happened to them. There are bits and pieces, but we know very little. Also, then further south in more mountainous, inaccessible areas where there were very few witnesses. There were no Americans. In our case, if you say Harpet, there's always American witnesses in English. How convenient for us, right? Yeah, but if you're Assyrian and you're living in those mountains, there are very little. In the Urmia region, there were some Americans who do talk about it, but we know very little about the Assyrians. So I don't have a satisfactory answer to you. Gentlemen.
So two questions. One is about the timeline of the city of Van actually falling to the Turkish military forces before the arrival of the Russians. What's the timeline of that fall of the Russians?
Van was part of the Ottoman Empire, was part of it, as you say, the Turkish Empire. They entered the war against the Russians advance and go back, and then they advance the second time. The second time, they take the city of Van itself. And then they go back again, so that the front keeps moving backwards and forwards. And Armenians also, in the second time when they went back, the mass exodus, Great Kaf, the great exodus where Armenians took place at that time. The Russians advanced at another time, but Armenians were not allowed to come back. They stayed in the Caucasus.
Was that July?
Well, July was the Great Exodus, yes.
The Great Exodus.
Yeah.
No, just regarding the question. 7th of May, okay, 4th of May, volunteers enter Van.
4th of May, volunteers enter Van.
7th of May, Russian armies enter. 18th of July, this is all calendar.
Okay, yeah. 18th, end of July, that's why I said.
18th of July, that is end of July, the order to leave. And at that time there was no Ottoman army around actually.
Yeah.
But supposedly they were advancing.
Yes, people argue whether it was necessary for the Russians to withdraw. You know, was it a political decision or was it a military decision? I'm not sure it's clear. I mean, I've heard both arguments. I don't take a play. I simply say what's in the book. But the Russians said, we will withdraw because we expect an Ottoman advance, a counterattack, and we advise Armenians to leave everything behind and to come. So it was relatively haphazard, and again, because of that reason, there were many, many casualties. But again, these are all points of interest and that require more research. Yeah.
So the second question is about how is it that the Turkish denialists did not know about the extensive archives and documentation about Van? I mean, were they that sloppy of researchers?
Well, you know, were they if I may be sort of critical, I criticize Armenian historiography. I don't think we do enough. And I think that's given the deniers a sense of what they can, they can't say. I don't think they realize. Like in 2012, the Armenian National Archives published 3 volumes in a very good way of these affidavits. And the first volume is only in Van, about 300 statements of different villages of Van, what happened to them, or thereabouts. Now, 2012, right?
Yeah.
That is not by historiography. We have books being published by American Armenian historian like Ron Sunny. It's not even bibliography. So if you're a Turkish denier and you don't see this stuff being used, you assume it doesn't exist. So I think they miscalculated. And I think this is their weakness. Now they're trapped by their own complacency because they are unanswerable. So in fact, this is a project, I hope Yektan will agree to work with me. It'd be interesting to do a systematic analysis of these reports on a regional level of how the local massacre would take part, because we know who were the officials, which Kurdish leaders were co-opted to carry out the massacres, the days on which the massacres took place, the number of victims. I mean, because these affidavits are collected according to a questionnaire. Systematic questions were being asked, so there's a structure to their content, and it lends itself to analysis, even quantification. So this is something I'm going to discuss with Yektan tomorrow. I just met him today. So in that sense, it's very exciting in the sense that it's for counterattack. This is why history matters. So much of our history has not been written yet. But from a denialist perspective, I think they're miscalculated, and I think this is their weakness. But unless you call on them, they will continue, because their work has been being published by Palgrave, by Penguin Books. It's being circulated as if it's legitimate. It is not legitimate. But unless you challenge it in an informed and a critical way, you know, Armenians say this, so-and-so say that, it's wishy-washy. But we can make a much more categorical and powerful case. But the onus is on us to argue our own case. Other people will not do so. But it's exciting because at least we have material to work with. Yeah. And this is a whole process of history writing, you know, having a voice. Are you willing to take on the burden to take on that work?
Just a couple of words. Thank you very much for translating this book, because I think this is going to be a major turning point in the study of genocide. For the reasons that you started in your wonderful talk. But I also like to bring to say that I think there's much fault of non-denialist scholars, including Armenians as well, in this situation. Because for a long time, Armenian scholars themselves refused to use Armenian sources. Yes. Right? Because they allowed, like, they were kind of hijacked by this denialism versus proof kind of thing. And when if you're trying to prove something, you then, like, move towards supposedly objective documents. Yeah. What is objective then? An Armenian writing about Armenian genocide for many Armenians was not good enough to bring to the table. Yes. I think what we need to do is, like, stop responding to deniers. Because, but yet, try to develop a very analytical and nuanced understanding of genocide, and getting rid of this idea that victims need to be just, these helpless human beings. They're not. This would be, I mean, the last thing maybe, like, would be said about what happened in one is a rebellion. But even if this was a rebellion, it wouldn't make it less of a genocide. Right? Because, that you have to, like, have a really very caricatured understanding of genocide, simplistic understanding. And this is, like, you are opening a really beautiful, I mean,
actually, because Ado does that's the whole point. Ado doesn't shy away from discussing Armenians arming themselves, the whole logic of arming themselves, actually rebelling, as you say, against in this particular context. It's still not justification of genocide. But the point you touched on earlier is correct. Armenians cannot generally use Armenian sources, including Vahat and Dadurian, by the way. Maybe because you think you make a stronger case if you use German, but you couldn't write a history of the Holocaust, for example, without using Jewish sources. I mean, the victim is there. You can unpack the language, take some of the certain elements out, but the victim's voice is extremely important. Ado is one of them, as a witness as well as an intermediary, because he's talking to witnesses and he's conveying this in his report. And because we can show he's a man of integrity, we can use his conveyance of primary sources in some ways with some confidence. And there are other such works, by the way. One of the other works I would like to translate is General Sebu's account. I don't know if you've read it, but General Sebu was a Gamavor, an Armenian volunteer who fought all the way to Van during this period. In the end, ended up being a governor of Erzincan. It's an amazing account, absolutely amazing. You don't see it in any of historiography. And you realize it's artful. And then the affidavits are saying, but it's not just because, some of the reason I agree with Yektan, but I also think that many Armenian scholars don't know Armenian well enough to use this material, or they're not willing to do research. I'm being very critical. I've always said that. We are not doing ourselves a favor, but then there's also an opportunity. Young scholars, I would like to do more myself. So we have material to work with. We have archives to work with. And especially when you use the different archives at the same time, because our own narrative is not that different from a Turkish narrative in terms of archival resources. The difference is that Our own materials tell us more about those incidents than the Turkish ones do. The dates are the same, but it's just like the Turkish sources talk about deportation of Armenian intellectuals. They just don't tell you what happened to those people. So the dates are correct when the deportations took place, how many people were sent out. But the Turkish sources simply go quiet. Well, what happened afterwards? Well, our sources will tell the same thing, but will also tell you what happened afterwards. And using these different archives, different sources, corroborating information, this is what historians do anyway. And this is good historiography. And the Armenian element, the Armenian language element, used critically, of course, is an essential part of that. So it's exciting, if it weren't so morbid subject, but it's certainly exciting because there's so much material to work with. And the Van is no exception to that, including the archival records that have not really been mined. I believe you're the only one who's done it so far in your dissertation. Look forward to your book. But there's a lot more we can do with that material because Armenian archives are sitting there, and not just in Armenia, but in Paris, in Marseille, and other places too as well.
Do you want to mention the Eintop, the book?
Yeah, we have a new book coming up, another account of Eintop. It was translated by Umit Kurt, who's been here. It's about the Armenian resistance, fighting resistance in Eintop in 1921, just after World War I, about which we know very little. We know the defense of Van, it's better to know, but there are other cases where Armenians have fought for their own rights against, and in their own interests in the Ottoman Empire, or former Ottoman Empire. Eintop, at the end of World War I, during the French occupation, the Kemalist movement, was another case. And there are the cases where Armenians have fought back, and it lends itself to discussion, and as the Yekta said as well, we don't have to be defensive. Maybe we shouldn't talk about the fact we Armenians fought back, because then it feeds into a denial, Turkish narrative, Armenians were rebels. No, they were not rebels. They were people who fought in their own defense. And this is something, as Armenians, we should be proud of. We should be proud of the fact that, yes, we will stand our ground. And you could argue rhetorically, as Armenians did in Karabakh too, and they won, because this is the nature of politics, and sometimes you have to resort to arms in your own self-defense. And Van was clearly such a case.
3 years ago, at the 100 years of the Armenian genocide, we heard that Vatican released some important archive documents. Is there any truth in that? Is there any benefit for us?
Vatican archives?
Yes.
But all archives are beneficial, including as a Turkish one.
But those particular ones from Vatican, are they?
I'm sure they are. Often in archives, you don't know what's important. You corroborate, but yes, some of them give you entirely new materials. Others corroborate information you have, but that's important. I don't know anyone who's worked on it in detail. I haven't in person anyway. But there are Spanish archives. The Spaniards in the Ottoman Empire, their consuls. I don't know anybody who's worked on that. So these are all fresh fields. The Spanish speakers here. You imagine doing Armenian genocide research in Spanish. Well, you could.
Yeah.
And by the way, talking of being critical in Spanish, there's a very famous Venezuelan officer, Rafael Nogales, 4 years beneath the crescent. He has a very detailed account of Van and fighting. He was fighting on the Turkish side. His narrative is very powerful. One thing I learned working on this in Ado was that, Nogales exaggerates. He exaggerates. So even this pro-Armenian narrative, he's an Armenian, he has great respect for Armenians. I realized that it's actually, I'd be very cautious about using Nogales. And this is something we should say quite openly. Just because it seems to be pro-Armenian, we should use it, rubbish. We want to know the truth, whatever it is. We're not looking, it's not a football match we just want to win. We want to know the truth. And in this case, I would qualify someone like Nogales. So history writing process is very exciting, and we have to do with integrity for ourselves, but also if we want Turks to respect a common narrative, we say, well, what are the standards? We want very high standards. So if we find that even Armenian sources or other sources, they seem to be pro-Armenian, but actually they're questionable, we should be the first ones saying so. So we want high standards, and this is the way we resolve our differences. I'm putting deniers at one side, but there are many Turkish historians today who sort of believe their own historiography. If you want to win them over, you have to show that you have integrity, that you know party isn't to hurt them, you're after the truth as much as they are, and then once you agree these high standards, this is also the way you will resolve your differences with people with whom you disagree. All right? So we need that discipline, we need that critical edge, and I think we should be brave enough to take that step. When I first went to Turkish archives, I was one of the first people to work in the early 1990s. I was very conscious. I said, what if I find material that contradicts my thesis? You know what I said? I said, I have an obligation to tell you exactly what I found, right? We know, because I'm not the censor, because we want our narrative to be based on truth. But that's also the strength of our narrative. If I believe in the Armenian genocide thesis, it's because I've tried to disprove it. I've looked for evidence that disproves it, and I haven't found it. So when I was very conscious of it when I went to Vasbouragan for the first time. Is there evidence to suggest that, well, maybe the Turks feared the Armenians? Maybe they had reason to fear the Armenians to the point where they did some radical things. Maybe the genocide wasn't as bad as we think. Maybe more people survived, blah, blah, blah. I mean, these are questions that did go through my mind. I said, well, look, if I find evidence such as that, I'm obliged to tell you that. As a public intellectual, I'm obliged to tell you that. And I can tell you, well, I didn't find it. And that's the strength of my understanding, and also should be the strength of our collective understanding, because we should raise the hardest questions ourselves in order to establish our thesis with credibility. It's not a football match we're playing, and we want to come to a common understanding with also Turks and Kurds based on truth. And if they would say the same thing, then academia has an important role to play in resolving differences. All right, but we need to maintain those standards. Okay.
Just to supplement something on the history, the idea of the micro-history. So recently, Armenian historiography is moving towards the micro-history, which Yektan has done, Umid is doing in Aintab, others have done in Digranagert, in other places. And it's going along with the argument that Ara Sarafian made, that we are now moving, when I say we, Armenian historiography is moving into an understanding not only of just the political events, but the social and cultural context of those events. And that helps us understand the relationships between the Armenians and the Turks and the Kurds. And there's still much to learn about that. So I want to thank once again Ara for coming all the way from London to be with us today. Thank you, Ara. I want to remind you that next Friday night will be our concert, the Chilingirian Bagratuni Hagopian concert. I'd also like to thank the AGBU for providing refreshments tonight. Tonight we're kind of sharing the gallery space with our neighbors across the way, so as you exit today, kind of go to the left, you'll see our table with our reception. Ara will be out there and you'll have an opportunity to talk to him, and anybody that would like books, I do have some of the, one copy of a few of his books that we have, but if you'd like the Von 1915, I will take a list and then he will be in contact with you. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next Friday. Thank you.